The signal came from nowhere anyone wanted to go. It was faint, broken, repeating on a frequency so old that most modern ships would have filtered it out as background noise. But the communications officer aboard the ESS Commonwealth Bridge was not most officers. And he was not in the habit of ignoring things that sounded like someone calling for help. Lieutenant Rosh Ackerman sat up straight in his chair and pressed his headset closer to his ear, his fingers already dancing across the console as the sound played again and again in a loop that felt less like a transmission and more like a prayer. "Captain," he said, his voice tight with something between excitement and dread, "you need to hear this." Captain Alaram Wangi was standing near the observation window on the bridge of the Commonwealth Bridge, a deep space survey vessel that had been mapping the outer edges of known space for the better part of 6 months. And she turned with the calm expression of authority. Someone who had heard 1,000 strange things in her career, but was always ready for one more. She walked to his station and leaned in as he played it through the speakers for the whole bridge to hear. The sound was alien, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. And yet there was something in it that every person on that bridge understood without needing a translation. It was sadness, deep and heavy and old, the kind of sadness that had been carried so long it had become part of the voice itself. Ackerman ran it through every linguistic database they had, and none of them could match it to any known species in the Galactic Concordance, the governing body that oversaw more than 4,000 spacefaring civilizations across the galaxy. But after an hour of work, he managed to pull fragments of meaning from the repeating message, and when he read them aloud, the bridge went silent. "We are still here," he said quietly. "We remember the stars." The signal was coming from the Dead Rim. Everyone on the bridge knew what the Dead Rim was, even if none of them had ever been there, because it was the kind of place that existed more as a warning than a location. A vast stretch of empty space at the edge of the galaxy, where there were no trade routes, no stations, no stars worth naming, and no reason to go unless you had been sent there to disappear. The Galactic Concordance had a system for deciding which species deserved to exist among the stars, and which ones did not. And they called the ones who failed their tests unviable. Too small in number, too strange in body, too different in mind, or simply too inconvenient for the species that held power. And when a species was declared unviable, they were stripped of everything and pushed into the Dead Rim to fade away where no one had to watch. It was not spoken of in polite galactic company, and most species preferred to pretend it was not happening at all. Captain Wangi stood very still for a long moment after Ackerman finished speaking, and then she turned to Ambassador Davi Keraz, the Earth Union diplomatic officer who had been assigned to the ship for exactly these kinds of situations, the ones where politics and survival got tangled together. "If we cross into the Dead Rim," she said, "what happens?" Keraz was a man who had built his career on knowing the exact boundaries of what was allowed and what was not, and his face told her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "It is not technically illegal for a human vessel," he said carefully, "but the Concordance considers it a provocation, and they will not be happy, and there could be diplomatic consequences that affect every human world in the Union." "And if we do not cross?" Wangi asked. "Then whoever is sending that signal keeps sending it until their power fails," Ackerman said from his station, not looking up, "and then they stop, and no one ever knows they were there." Wangi closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she saw a memory she had carried for 15 years. A colony world called Verada 3, where a reactor failure had poisoned the water supply, and she had arrived with a relief ship 2 days too late, and the silence of that place had never left her. She opened her eyes. "Take us in," she said. The Commonwealth Bridge crossed the Dead Rim boundary 4 hours later, and the stars grew thin around them until the darkness outside felt heavy and close like a blanket pulled too tight. And the crew grew quiet, in the way people do, when they can feel that they are somewhere they are not supposed to be. They followed the signal for another 6 hours, and when they finally found its source, every person on the bridge stood and stared. It was enormous. A station, or what had once been a station, built from the wreckage of hundreds of ships, welded and fused together in a way that spoke of desperation rather than design. A sprawling mass of metal and old hull plating that drifted in the dark like a wounded animal, too stubborn to die. And it was glowing. Faint lights pulsed across its surface in patterns that shifted and moved like something alive. Blues and greens and soft purples that rippled through the structure in waves, and it took the crew a moment to realize that the lights were not coming from the station itself. They were coming from the beings inside it. The Vilshi were aquatic, or at least they had been when they still had oceans, and their bodies produced bioluminescent light that changed color with their emotions. And right now, as the Commonwealth Bridge drew closer, and they pressed against the viewports of their dying station, their light was the pale blue of disbelief, and the trembling white of a hope they had not felt in a very long time. There were fewer than 80,000 of them left, and they had been here for 300 years, declared unviable by the Concordance, because their population was too small, and their biology was considered non-contributory to galactic civilization. 300 years in the dark, watching their station fall apart around them, watching their children born dimmer and dimmer each generation, as the despair sank so deep into them that even their light was dying. Captain Mwangi ordered the Commonwealth Bridge to dock with the station, and when the airlock opened and the first human stepped through, the Vilshi elder Thaloon was waiting on the other side. Thaloon was old, older than anyone on the human ship could guess, and the light in her body was so faint it was almost gone. But when she looked at the human beings standing in her doorway with food and medicine and no weapons drawn, something happened that the crew of the Commonwealth Bridge would never forget. She began to weep, and her tears were light, actual light, that fell from her face and floated in the low gravity like tiny stars being born. And the color of them was gold, pure gold, the color that the Vilshi reserved for a feeling they had no word for, because they had not felt it in 3 centuries. Behind Mwangi, Ambassador Keros was already composing a furious mental draft of the diplomatic disaster he would have to manage. But even he could not look away from those golden tears, and even he could not pretend that this was anything other than what it was. This was first contact with a people who had been left to die, and humanity had just told them they were not alone anymore. Mwangi reached out and took Thaloon's hand, gently, carefully, the way you hold something precious, and she said the only thing that mattered. "We are here," she said, "and we are not leaving." Behind them, the crew began unloading supplies, and in the station, the Vilshi began to glow brighter, one by one. Was lighting candles in a house that had been dark for far too long. The transmission from the Commonwealth Bridge reached Earth 7 days after Captain Mwangi docked with the Vilshi station, and it did not arrive quietly. It came with footage, hours of it, showing the crumbling station held together with nothing but old welds and stubborn hope, showing the Vilshi children whose light was barely a whisper under their skin, showing the frozen wreckage of other ships drifting nearby that belonged to species no one in the Concordance had mentioned in decades, species that had simply been erased from the records as if they had never existed at all. But the footage was not the worst part. The worst part was what Mwangi found when she sent scout drones deeper into the dead rim, because the Vilshi were not alone out there, not even close. Within a radius of just 40 light-years from the Vilshi station, the drones found 11 more groups of exiled species, each one clinging to survival in their own desperate way, carrying the same look in their eyes, or their sensors, or their electromagnetic fields, the look of people who had stopped expecting anyone to come. There were the Dreth, massive silicon-based beings whose bodies were made of living stone and crystal, declared unviable because their biology was incompatible with standard galactic infrastructure, which really meant that no one wanted to spend the money to build doors big enough for them. There was the Shale Collective, a fragmented hive mind species that existed as dozens of linked consciousnesses sharing one identity, exiled because the Concordance had classified all hive minds as existential destabilizers, a fancy way of saying they made the powerful species nervous. There were the Keth, tiny winged creatures no larger than a human hand, who communicated through patterns of dance and color, thrown out because their world had been absorbed by a larger empire and they had refused to submit. Others, so many others, each with their own story of rejection that always ended the same way, with a long silence in the dark. Wangi sent all of it to Earth, every image and every data file and every recording of every voice that had been calling out to a galaxy that had stopped listening. And she sent it on an open channel, because she knew that if she sent it through official diplomatic channels, it would be buried and classified and forgotten. She was right to do it that way, because within 12 hours, the entire human population had seen it. The reaction was not what the Concordance expected. Across Earth and Mars and Luna and every colony world in the Union, people watched the footage, and something old and deep inside of humanity woke up. Something that remembered what it felt like to be turned away, to be told you were not enough, to be pushed to the margins and left there, because humanity had done this to each other for thousands of years before they had finally learned, painfully, imperfectly, but genuinely, that every life had value. The protests started small, in university squares and public parks, but within days they were everywhere. Millions of people carrying signs and filling streets, not in anger at the refugees, but in anger at a galaxy that could throw people away like garbage and call it policy. The phrase, "give them a home," appeared on walls and screens and shirts across every human world. And it was not a suggestion. It was a demand. In the halls of the Earth Union government, Secretary General Amara Osei sat at her desk and watched the footage for the 4th time. And each time she watched it, she felt the same thing, a cold fury that started in her chest and spread outward until her hands were shaking. Osei had been born in a refugee camp on Earth 63 years ago, the daughter of parents who had fled a climate collapse that had swallowed their homeland. What it meant to be told that there was no room for you, that your suffering was someone else's problem, that you should go somewhere else and be quiet about it. She had clawed her way from that camp to the highest office in the Earth Union because she had believed that humanity had moved past that kind of cruelty. And now she was watching an entire galaxy practice it on a scale that made human history look small. Her advisors filed into the room, one by one, and most of them said the same thing in different words, that it was terrible, that it was wrong, that something should be done eventually through proper channels, and that in the meantime, Earth should not risk its standing with the Concordance over species that were not their responsibility. Osei listened to all of them, and then she asked a single question. If it were us out there, if humanity had been the ones declared unviable and pushed into the dark, would you want someone to come? Went quiet. 3 days later, the Concordance arbiter Zelphus Ron arrived in the Sol system aboard a diplomatic cruiser that was larger than some of Earth's space stations. And Ron was everything the Concordance wanted their representatives to be. Tall, precise, insectoid, with multifaceted eyes that reflected nothing, and a voice that carried the weight of 10,000 years of galactic authority. Ron requested an audience with Secretary General Osei, and was granted one, and the two of them sat across from each other in a room that suddenly felt very small. The unviable classifications exist for a reason, Ron said in that smooth, measured voice. The Concordance has maintained galactic stability for millennia, through careful management of species populations and contributions. And the system works because every member respects it, even when it is difficult. Difficult, Osei repeated, and the word came out flat and cold. Interfere, Ron continued. There will be consequences. Economic sanctions, restricted trade routes, and the possibility that Earth itself may be reviewed for reclassification. And I say this not as a threat, but as a reality of how the Concordance functions. Osei looked at Ron for a long moment, and then she leaned forward. Arbiter Ron, she said, I grew up in a camp made of plastic sheets and mud, surrounded by people who had been told they were not worth saving, and I watched some of them die because the world had decided their lives were not a priority. And I promised myself that if I ever had the power to open a door for someone who had been shut out, I would open it so wide that no one could ever close it again. She stood up. You may tell the Concordance that Earth formally and permanently rejects the unviable classification system, and you may tell them that as of this moment, the Earth Union will accept any and all species designated as unviable. Refugees under our full protection and sovereignty. Ron's compound eyes shifted in a way that might have been surprise. You understand what this means? Ron said. I understand exactly what it means, Osei replied. The announcement went out 1 hour later on every channel humanity had access to, broadcast in 300 languages and 47 xenolinguistic formats, and it was simple and clear, and it left no room for misunderstanding. No species dies on our watch, Osei said to the cameras and the microphones and the entire watching galaxy. Not while we have air to share and ground to stand on. If the galaxy will not give them a home, then humanity will, and we will not apologize for it. The Concordance responded within the day. Trade sanctions, travel restrictions, and a formal condemnation that called humanity's actions destabilizing and reckless. And overnight the human economy took a hit that economists said would take years to recover from. But something else happened too. Something the Concordance had not planned for. Out in the dead rim, where dozens of dying species huddled in the dark and listened to their radios with whatever hope they had left, Osei's words arrived like sunrise after the longest night any of them had ever known. And on the Vilshi station, Falun the Elder heard the message, and her light blazed so bright that for one moment the entire station looked the way it must have looked 3 centuries ago, when her people still believed they had a future. The Vilshi had a word for what they were feeling, a word they had not used in so long that the youngest generation had to ask the elders what it meant. The word translated roughly as, someone came. The first ships arrived at Earth's outer colonies within 3 weeks of Secretary General Osei's declaration. And nothing could have fully prepared humanity for what came next. It was one thing to say, we will take them all, and another thing entirely to figure out how to house a species that breathed methane, or one that needed to be submerged in pressurized salt water at all times, or one that communicated through magnetic pulses that accidentally wiped every hard drive within 50 meters, or one that existed partially in a dimension that human scientists did not even have a name for yet. The Haven Project was born out of necessity and desperation, and a stubborn refusal to admit that the task was impossible. And it became the largest cooperative effort in human history. Engineers, biologists, linguists, architects, artists, doctors, and ordinary people who simply showed up and asked, "Where do you need me?" All of them working together to solve problems that no one had ever faced before. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was a xenobiologist stationed on Mars, and she had spent her career studying alien life from a comfortable distance, through papers and samples and holographic models. But now, she was standing in a converted warehouse, staring at a Dreth named Gorvon, who was 3 meters tall and made of living granite, and who was looking at her with eyes like molten copper, as if daring her to be afraid. She was afraid, but she did not leave. "We need to understand your biology," she said to him, through a translator device that turned her words into deep vibrations he could feel through the floor. "So we can build you a place that feels like home." Gorvan stared at her for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded like rocks grinding together, in a way that the translator rendered as flat and suspicious. "No one has ever asked what home feels like to a Dreth," he said. "Then you will be the first to tell us," replied. The Dreth were the hardest to reach at first, because they had been alone the longest and trusted the least. But they were also the ones who changed the most visibly once trust began to form. And it began in the most unlikely place, a construction site on Luna Foreman. Trace Mobutu was a third-generation lunar construction engineer who had been building habitats and stations since he was old enough to hold a plasma welder. And when the Haven Project assigned him a mixed crew of humans and Dreth to build the first orbital Haven station, he did not make speeches or grand gestures. He simply handed Gorvan a beam and pointed to where it needed to go. Gorvan could work in hard vacuum without a suit, because his silicon body did not need oxygen in the same way, and he could lift loads that would have required 3 human workers and a crane. And he could shape metal with his bare hands by heating it against his core. And Mobutu watched all of this with the quiet appreciation of a craftsman recognizing another craftsman. At the end of the first shift, Mobutu walked up to Gorvan and said, "Good work," and nothing else. And Gorvan said nothing back, but he showed up for the next shift, and the one after that, and the one after that. By the end of the first month, they were working side by side without needing to speak at all, and the human and Dreth crews had developed a rhythm that made them faster and more efficient than any purely human team had ever been. And when a reporter asked Gorvan why he kept coming back, he said something that the translator struggled with for a moment, before rendering it as, "He did not offer me charity. He offered me a place in the work, and that is what the Dreth have always wanted." The Shale Collective had a different kind of struggle. Ili of Many was the name they used for the part of their consciousness that interfaced with other species. And Ili was terrified in a way that was hard for single-minded beings to understand, because the Shale were a hive mind, which meant they were never supposed to be alone. And yet, in the Dead Rim, their numbers had fallen so low that the connections between their nodes had grown thin and full of static, and Ili described the feeling as hearing your own family through a wall that keeps getting thicker. The Concordance had exiled them because hive minds made people uncomfortable, because the idea of a shared consciousness felt threatening to species that valued individual identity above all else, and so the Shale had been pushed out and forgotten and left to slowly lose themselves in the silence. But on Earth, a group of neuroscientists, led by a woman named Dr. Priya Sharma, became fascinated, rather than frightened, when they learned about the Shale. And they asked if they could study the hive-mind connection, not to control it or contain it, but to understand it, and maybe to help. Wary. And the first sessions were difficult, because the Shale's electromagnetic communication caused headaches in the humans, and the humans' individual thought patterns felt chaotic and noisy to the Shale. But Sharma and her team built an interface, a neural bridge that did not merge human and Shale minds, but allowed them to feel the edges of each other's thoughts, like two people pressing their hands against opposite sides of a window. And when Ili felt a human mind for the first time, felt the strange, beautiful loneliness of a being that was always just one voice in the dark, Ili wept in the way the Shale wept, which was a harmonic frequency that made every glass surface in the lab vibrate like a bell. "You are each so alone," Ili said through the interface, "and yet you choose to reach for each other anyway. How do you bear it?" "We bear it because of the reaching," Sharma said. After that, Ili began calling the human neuroscience team the warm nodes, and it was the highest compliment the Shale could give to anyone outside their collective. Meanwhile, on Mars, something small and beautiful was happening that no one had planned. A young Veelshi named Kale had been brought to the surface colony with a group of other refugees, and Kale was barely an adolescent by Veelshi standards. And like all the young Veelshi born in the Dead Rim, his light was faint, a dim flicker where there should have been a glow, a whisper where there should have been a song. The human children on Mars did not know any of this, and they did not care. They saw a being that could make light come out of his skin, and they thought it was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. And within a day, they had adopted Kale into their group, with the easy, fearless acceptance that children have before the world teaches them to be cautious. They played together in the low Martian gravity, bouncing and tumbling and laughing, asking Kale to show them colors. And Kale kept trying even though his light was weak. And one afternoon, while they were playing a game that involved chasing each other through the colony's garden dome, one of the human children tripped and fell and scraped her knee and started to cry. Kale did not think. He just reacted the way Veelshi always had for thousands of years when someone near them was hurting. And he knelt beside her and placed his hand over the scrape, and his light pulsed warm and gold, the color of comfort, the color of, "You are safe, I am here." And the light was bright, brighter than it had ever been in his entire life, brighter than any young Veelshi born in the Dead Rim had managed in 300 years, and the other Veelshi in the colony saw it, and stopped what they were doing and stared, because they understood what was happening, even if the humans did not. The Veelshi dimmed when they lost hope, and they brightened when they found it, and Kale's light was telling them something that their elders had almost stopped believing was possible. That the long dark was over, that they had found a place where they mattered, that someone had finally seen them and decided they were worth keeping. The news traveled fast through the refugee communities, and it traveled fast through the human ones too. And when the footage of a glowing alien child comforting a crying human girl on Mars hit the Solnet, it was shared 4 billion times in a single day. But not everything was light and warmth. The Concordance sanctions were real, and they hurt. Supply ships from allied species stopped coming. Trade routes that human colonies depended on were closed, and on the outer worlds, medicine and food began to run short. And the cost of compassion was no longer an abstract idea, but an empty shelf where there used to be antibiotics. And there were humans who were afraid, who looked at the aliens arriving on their worlds and saw not refugees, but threats. And on Europa, a bomb went off outside a Veelshi housing complex in the middle of the night. No one was killed, but the blast shattered the walls, and the Veelshi inside dimmed to almost nothing, their light retreating inward, the way it always did when they were terrified. Captain Mwangi, who had become a public figure, whether she wanted to or not, addressed the fear in a broadcast that reached every human world. "I know this is hard," she said. "I know we are paying a price, and I know some of you are scared. But I need you to look at them, really look at them, and tell me they are not worth it. They are not taking anything from us. They are making us more than we were." The bomber was caught within a week, and the Veelshi housing complex was rebuilt in 3 days by a volunteer crew that included humans and Dreth working side by side. And when it was finished, Gorvon placed a stone from his own body into the foundation, himself, and said nothing, because the Dreth did not need words for something that important. The blockade began on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Not with a dramatic declaration or an ultimatum delivered under flashing lights, but with the quiet appearance of 200 Concordance warships along the borders of human space, settling into position like a noose being drawn slowly tight. Fleet Admiral Kofi Asante saw them arrive on his tactical display from the bridge of the Earth Defense flagship Resolute, and he studied the formations with the calm patience of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for a fight he hoped would never come. The Concordance was not subtle about its message. surrender the unviable species, or face total isolation from the galactic community, cut off from trade and technology and everything that connected humanity to the wider universe. But there was a second message underneath the first one, unspoken but clear. If humanity did not comply, the blockade could become something worse. Asante called his senior officers together and gave them orders that surprised no one who knew him. "We do not position for attack," he said. "We position for defense. Every ship in the fleet forms a protective ring around the haven stations and the refugee colonies. And we make it very clear that we are not interested in a war, but we are absolutely prepared to make one very expensive for anyone who starts it." The Earth Defense Fleet moved into position within hours, spreading out in a formation that military analysts on both sides recognized as the Shield Wall, an old human naval doctrine designed not to project power, but to absorb it, to say without words that you could hit as hard as you wanted, but you are not getting through. Asante broadcast on every open frequency in every language the translators could manage. "We are not your enemy," he said to the Concordance fleet. "We have no quarrel with any species in this galaxy, but behind us are people who have nowhere else to go. We will not move, and we will not hand them over. And if you want them, you will have to come through us. And I promise you it will not be easy, and it will not be quiet, and the whole galaxy will see what you do here today." For 3 days, nothing moved, and the silence between the two fleets was so heavy, it felt like the vacuum itself was holding its breath. And then everything changed, because of a leak. Ambassador Yervan of the Lorith, an avian species known for their empathic abilities and their long, elegant necks, and their tradition of speaking truth even when it was dangerous, had served in the Concordance Diplomatic Corps for over 50 years, and for over 50 years she had carried a secret that had slowly eaten away at her conscience like acid through metal. She had access to the classified archives, the ones that held the real records behind every unviable declaration ever issued, and she knew what no ordinary citizen of the Concordance was ever supposed to know. Supposed to know that the entire system was a lie. The unviable classifications had never been about biology, or population size, or contribution to galactic civilization. They had been about power, pure and simple. The Vielshi had been classified because their bioluminescent communication technology threatened to make a Tyranny-controlled communications monopoly obsolete, and removing them from the galactic stage eliminated the competition. The Dreth had been classified because their ability to build in extreme environments made them valuable labor that certain species wanted to control, and when the Dreth refused to submit, their skills were reframed as a threat rather than a gift. The Shale Collective had been classified because a hive mind species that could link consciousnesses across vast distances was terrifying to governments that relied on controlling information, and it was easier to call them dangerous than to admit you were afraid of what they could become. Every single unviable declaration in the Concordance's 10,000-year history had been the same. Not a biological judgment, but a political assassination carried out with paperwork instead of weapons. A way for the powerful to eliminate anyone who threatened their position while pretending it was for the good of the galaxy. Yervan released everything, every file, every internal memo, every classified discussion, where Concordance leaders openly laughed about the species they had condemned to death. And she released it not through back channels or anonymous drops, but in a formal address to the Galactic Assembly, standing at the podium with her feathers raised in the laureate posture of absolute truth, her voice shaking but unbroken. "We did not remove the unviable because they were weak," she said. "We removed them because they were inconvenient, and we told ourselves it was necessary, and we told our children it was justice. So, we could keep our power, and our comfort, and our clean consciences, and I am done being silent about it." The reaction across the galaxy was like an earthquake that started deep underground and cracked every foundation that had been built on top of it. Species that had lost allies and trading partners and even family to the unviable system suddenly understood what had really happened, and the grief and the rage that followed were enormous, not just at the tyranny and the other species who had controlled the system, but at themselves for never questioning it, for accepting the disappearance of entire civilizations as just the way things were. The tyranny leadership, seeing their control slipping, did what cornered powers have always done throughout history. They doubled down. Grand Marshal Vreth, commander of the Tyranny Warfleet, received orders to advance on human space and end the crisis by force, and she was the kind of officer who had built her career on that. Obedience and efficiency and the unshakable belief that the Concordance's authority was the only thing standing between the galaxy and chaos. She gave the order to advance, and 200 warships began to move toward the human defensive line. On Haven Station 1, where the rescued species had built their new lives over the past months, the news arrived like a cold wind, and for a moment the old fear returned. The fear of being cast out again, of being told that their safety was temporary and conditional, of being sacrificed to keep the peace. But something was different now. The exiled species had lived among humans long enough to learn something that the Concordance had never taught them, that you did not have to be powerful to matter, that your worth was not determined by what you could produce, but by who you were, and that when someone stood up for you, the right thing to do was stand up with them. The species held a council in the Great Hall of Haven. Station 1, and every single one of them voted the same way. Gorvan spoke for the Dreth, and his voice was like thunder, rolling through stone. The humans gave us a floor to stand on, he said. They did not ask what we could give them. They asked what we needed. And now they are standing between us and the ones who threw us away. And I will not hide behind them like a coward. The Dreth will fight. Ili of Many spoke for the Shale, and for the first time in the memory of anyone present, every node of the collective spoke in perfect unison. We were scattered and afraid and fading, Ili said. The humans did not look at us and see a threat. They saw a family that was losing itself, and they helped us hold on. We will link our consciousness with their communication networks, and give them eyes and ears across every frequency the Concordance uses, because if they are our voice, then we will be their sight. And the Vilshi elder Thaloon spoke last. Her light was steady and fierce in a way that the younger Vilshi had never seen from her before. Our light operates on quantum frequencies, she said, and we have kept this knowledge to ourselves because we were afraid of what others might do with it. But the time for hiding is over. We can disrupt the targeting systems of any fleet that approaches within range, and we will, because this station and these people and this impossible, beautiful home they have built for us is worth defending. The unviable species turned out to be anything but. When the Tyranny fleet crossed the boundary into human space, they expected to find a small defense force protecting a collection of helpless refugees, and what they found instead was a fully integrated defense network. Human ships guided by shale-enhanced sensors that could detect a missile launch before the button was pressed, protected by Vilshi quantum interference that turned their targeting computers into useless noise, supported by Dreth engineers who could repair hull breaches in minutes by literally melding with the damaged metal. The Tyranny fleet stopped, not because they were ordered to, but because their instruments were screaming and their weapons could not lock on, and every scan they ran showed them a force that should not have been possible. A force made up of the broken and the rejected and the forgotten, standing together in a wall of light and stone and shared minds, that the entire Concordance had underestimated, because they had never bothered to look. And behind them, arriving in ones and twos and then in dozens, came the ships of 46 Concordance member species, not warships, but diplomatic vessels, each one broadcasting the same message: We withdraw from the blockade. The galaxy was choosing a side, and it was not the side that had spent 10,000 years throwing people away. Grand Marshal Vreth stood on the command bridge of her flagship and watched her tactical display fall apart, piece by piece like a painting dissolving in the rain. 46 species had withdrawn from the blockade, and their ships were peeling away from the formation in a slow, deliberate cascade that left the Turani fleet exposed and alone in a way that Vreth had never experienced in her entire military career. She had always fought with the weight of the concordance behind her, with the certainty that the galaxy's authority was on her side, and now that certainty was gone, and what remained was just a fleet of warships pointing their weapons at a group of people who had done nothing wrong except refuse to let the unwanted die. Her weapons officer reported that targeting systems were still scrambled by the Vilshi quantum interference, and that the shale-enhanced sensor network was feeding the human fleet real-time data on every Turani ship movement before the movements were even completed, and the tactical situation was not just unfavorable, it was impossible. But Vreth was Turani, and the Turani did not retreat, and she opened her mouth to give the order to attack anyway. And her first officer refused. Commander Sethik stood at his station with his compound eyes locked on Vreth, and his posture rigid in a Turani way that meant absolute resolve, and he said words that had not been spoken to a Grand Marshal in living memory. "No," he said. Vreth turned to him with a fury that could have melted steel. "You dare?" "I dare because I watched the broadcasts from Haven Station," Sethik said, and his voice was steady, even though his antennae were trembling. "I watched a Vilshi child glow for the first time in 300 years because a human girl held his hand. And I watched a Dreth warrior lay a piece of his own body into a foundation stone because he finally had something worth building. Collectives speak in one voice for the first time in their history because someone made them feel whole. And you are asking me to fire on that." He looked around the bridge, and one by one the other officers met his eyes. "You will have to find someone else to give that order," Sethik said, "because no one on this bridge will carry it out." Vreth looked at her crew, the crew that had followed her through a dozen campaigns without question, and saw something in their faces that she had never seen before. Something that the Turani did not have a word for, because they had never needed one. It was shame. The Turani fleet powered down its weapons, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing the galaxy had heard in 10,000 years. The emergency session of the Galactic Concordance convened on Thresar Prime 3 days later, and it was chaos in a way that the ancient institution had never experienced. Delegates from hundreds of species shouting over each other, alliances that had held for millennia crumbling in real time, and at the center of it all, a question that no one could avoid any longer. How many species had they killed? The classified files that Ambassador Yervon had released were now public knowledge, and the numbers were staggering. Over the course of 10,000 years, the Concordance had declared more than 800 species unviable, and of those 800, fewer than 60 had survived the exile, and the rest were gone forever. Their cultures and histories and languages and children lost to the dark, because someone in a position of power had decided they were inconvenient. The Loris delegation formally proposed the abolition of the unviable classification system, and the vote that followed was not close. It passed with the support of over 3,000 species, opposed only by the Turani and a handful of their closest allies. And when the result was announced, the chamber erupted in a sound that the translators could not fully render, because it was made up of too many species expressing relief and grief and hope all at once. The Dead Rim was officially opened, and within hours, rescue missions launched from dozens of worlds, human and alien alike, heading into the void to find whatever remained of the species that had been left there to die. Some they found alive, battered and broken, but still breathing, still remembering the stars, the way the Vilshi signal had said. and some they found only as ruins, empty stations, and silent ships, and the remains of civilizations that had waited for help that came too late. For those species, there would be memorials, built by the hands and claws and crystalline limbs of every rescued species working together, so that the galaxy would never be allowed to forget what had been done in its name. The Concordance offered to lift all sanctions against humanity and restore Earth's full standing. Offered it with the kind of generous language that powerful institutions use when they are trying to pretend that their surrender is actually a gift. Secretary General Osei accepted, but she was not finished. "We will rejoin the Concordance," she said, standing before the assembly with the same fire in her eyes that had burned there since the day she had watched the footage from the Dead Rim. "But we have a condition, the establishment of a permanent galactic refugee charter, written not by the powerful, but by the powerless, authored by the species that survived your system, so that their voices are the ones that shape the future, and not the voices of those who tried to silence them." The Concordance agreed, because they no longer had the standing to refuse, and the charter was written over the following months by representatives of every rescued species, each one contributing a piece of their experience and their wisdom and their hard-won understanding of what it meant to be cast out and what it meant to be brought home. On Haven Station 1, the ceremony to mark the charter's completion was held in the Great Hall, and it was full in a way that it had never been before, not just with the rescued species, but with representatives from across the galaxy who had come to witness and to honor, and to begin the long work of making amends. Thaloon the Velshi Elder stood at the center of the hall, and her light was so bright that the humans nearby had to shield their eyes, and the colors that moved through her body were ones that the Velshi scholars said had not been seen since before the exile. Deep golds and vibrant blues, and a shimmering white that meant joy so profound it had no bottom. "For 300 years we dimmed," Thaloon said, and her voice resonated through the hall with the harmonic richness of a Velshi who had fully found her light again. "We dimmed because we believed we had been forgotten, and we dimmed because we believed we did not matter, and we dimmed because when you take away a people's future, you take away the thing that makes them shine. But you gave it back to us, you impossible, stubborn, beautiful humans. You gave it back to us by doing the simplest thing in the universe. You saw us, and you said, 'You are welcome here.'" Gorvan spoke next, and his voice filled the hall like an avalanche given words. He did not make a speech, because the Dreth did not believe in speeches. Instead he walked to the center of the hall, and placed a stone in the floor, a foundation stone carved from his own body, the way the Dreth had done for 10,000 years when they claimed a place as home, and he spoke its name. "Heartstone," he said, and the word in the Dreth language meant more than any translation could capture. It meant the rock that holds the fire, the ground that does not move, the place where you are safe and known and needed. And when he said it, every Dreth in the hall struck the floor with their fists, and the sound was like a drumbeat that you could feel in your bones. Ili of Many spoke last, and for the first time in the recorded history of the Shale Collective, every single node spoke as one voice, not the overlapping fractured chorus that the Shale had been reduced to in exile, but a single, clear, unified voice that rang through the hall like a bell made of living sound. "We were scattered," Ili said. "We were noise without pattern, signal without meaning, a family calling out to itself across a distance that kept growing. And you listened. You did not understand us, and you were sometimes afraid of us, but you listened, and you built a bridge between your minds and ours, and you showed us that connection does not require sameness. And we became a song again. We became whole, because you treated us not as a problem to be solved, but as a people to be known." Captain Elara Mwangi watched from the back of the hall, standing near the viewport of Haven Station 1, where she could see the stars outside, real stars, not the empty dark of the Dead Rim, but the bright burning heart of a galaxy that was finally starting to reckon with what it had done and who it wanted to become. She thought about the signal that had started it all, that broken, repeating cry from the void, "We are still here, we remember the stars." And she watched as ships from across the galaxy arrived at Haven Station, not carrying weapons or sanctions or ultimatums, but carrying building materials, and food and medicine, and families looking for a new beginning. She thought about what it had cost, the sanctions, the shortages, the bomb on Europa, the fear and the doubt and the long nights when it seemed like the whole galaxy was against them. And she thought about what it had given them in return, which was something that no amount of trade agreements or political alliances could ever match. Expected, forged not from blood or species or shared biology, but from the simple radical act of saying, "You matter," to someone the universe had thrown away. Years later, when historians from 100 worlds wrote about this time, they would argue about the politics and the economics and the military strategies, but they would all agree on one thing. When the galaxy asked what made humanity worthy of the stars, the answer was not their technology or their military or their territory. It was that they found the unwanted and the broken and the forgotten, the ones that everyone else had decided were not worth saving, and they said, "You are ours now. You are home." And in doing so, they did not just save the exiled, they saved the soul of a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to care. And in the great hall of Haven Station 1, surrounded by stone and light and song, the first door that humanity had opened stayed open, wide and bright and welcoming, and no one in the galaxy would ever be able to close it again.